Recently, at the NATO summit, Zelensky announced that Ukraine is winning. Just keep sending us weapons and money, especially that money. Putin replied, "Yet, Ukraine is not winning, Russia is winning. Western soldiers don't even know which bathroom to use." Biden, taking offense at this, told Putin, "I know which bathroom to use. It's just getting there in time's the problem." Also, Zelensky, Corn Pop says you better hurry up and win because we're running out of ammunition to send you. But here's some cluster bombs that we haven't used since the 80s. Nobody wants them, so you can have them. Good luck with that. Hello, everyone. I'm Bobtheorc, and welcome to News Snark, where we are almost as honest as CNN. Yes. So, what the hell is going on in Ukraine? Well, that depends. We've got kind of a tale of two narratives. You know, the Western media says that Ukraine's winning, that Russia's going to collapse, that Ukraine's on this major offensive, and Russia says, no, we're doing just fine. I don't know what you're talking about. And both can't be true. Ukraine says they're killing Russians at a rate of 10 to 1. Russia says they're killing Ukrainians at a rate of 10 to 1. So I don't know what the hell's going on. Well, if we look at the old battle map, you know, over here on militaryland.net, I'll put some links in the description below to some of the sources I use. This is from today, and the battle lines haven't really changed in a long time. You know, if we zoom in and look, there's a lot of Ukrainian forces, all these Ukrainian units just lined up there against what seems like a smaller Russian force. And, you know, from the very beginning, the Ukraine army has been larger than the Russians, presumably. You know, especially early on. You know, Russians have been conscripting more people or recruiting more people or contracting more people, depending on whose narrative you believe. And the Ukrainians have also been conscripting people. They've had you know, open drafts in several of their cities. So what's going on? Well, let's look into it. And maybe this is all just a big lie. I mean, both narratives can't be true. So what's going on? Well, my first question is why do these wars never end? You know, I mean, America has been involved either directly or indirectly in one war or another for most of my lifetime. You know, we had Afghanistan, we had Iraq 1, Afghanistan, Iraq 2, Syria, now Ukraine and Libya in between, and you know, the war on terror and all kinds of stuff. You know, I thought everything was supposed to be hunky-dory once the Cold War ended, but I guess that didn't happen, huh? So, what's with all these endless wars? I mean, World War II is the biggest thing that ever happened, and hell, we had that thing wrapped up in just a few years. You know, we've been at war forever now. And my advice would be, let's follow the money. You know, why do the same people keep getting rich? You know, the same people who brought us Iraq and the weapons of mass destruction seem to be the same crowd bringing us Ukraine. And, you know, there's a lot of money passing through Ukraine. All this money that we're supposedly sending to Ukraine, a lot of that is really just bouncing back to American firms, you know, American defense companies and whatnot. A lot of the stuff that we're selling them or giving them, you know, we're counting it, you know, as in the billions and tens of billions or however many that we're sending them. You know, a lot of this stuff's old stuff, and it's like we're dumping old stuff just so we can purchase new stuff from the same defense contractors. But who's getting rich from all this? Who's supplying all the stuff? And if we look at a lot of these scandals out there, you know, a lot of money has been flowing, you know, through Ukraine for, you know, as long as I can remember. And it's not just one party or the other. Both sides are doing, all the establishment guys. Look at anybody who's promoting the war, whether it's here or anywhere else. You know, all these pro-war politicians and pro-war elites, they're all making money somehow. So that's a little bit interesting, because if they weren't getting so rich from this, I'm sure we could have won something by now, or at least made peace. You know, back in the everybody thinks that the war in Ukraine started in 2022, even though it really started kind of in 2014, you know, when we may or may not have helped overthrow the Ukrainian government at the time. But even if we just look at the recent conflict, whether you call it an invasion or special military operation or whatever you want to call it, within a couple of months, Zelensky and Putin just about had a peace agreement. They had everything, kind of the rough idea signed, and then Boris Johnson went over, presumably on the request of the Americans, because England doesn't really do anything without the Americans agreeing. And scuttled the whole deal. Suddenly Zelensky backed out. We promised him unlimited support, unlimited money, unlimited weapons. So what happened? So that's a really good question. Why does this never end? Personally, I thought Russia was going to just raffle stomp through Ukraine. I was kind of surprised to learn that Ukraine had a much larger army than Russia. How did they get such a big army? I guess we've been pumping a lot of money into them for a long time. And how come all these politicians' kids have various board memberships and seats at these Ukrainian companies? It's not just Hunter, by the way. A lot of them have it. If you check out one of my earlier videos, the explaining Ukraine in 5 minutes, it talks about a lot of the politicians whose kids are involved in Ukrainian money. So my big question is, where have I seen this movie before? The evil bad guys, we have to go dump unlimited money into this place, and then we're going to fight to the very last foreigner and then back out. I mean, anybody think of maybe Iraq or Afghanistan? No, that can't possibly be it. We stormed on into Afghanistan. We took over and occupied the country and held everything together for decades, and then all of a sudden, poof, we're gone. I guess the money ran out. It wasn't profitable anymore. They had other ideas, and Taliban's back in control again. We invaded Iraq to get rid of Saddam and weapons of mass destruction and bring freedom and all that. There weren't any weapons of mass destruction, and after we got rid of Saddam and we sort of backed out, then suddenly ISIS was there, and we may or may not have funded them. Well, that's weird. Why do we keep funding all these bad groups? I mean, in Afghanistan, we funded the Taliban. In Ukraine, we funded the Azovs, who, up until a few years ago, we had them labeled as a Nazi terrorist group. Even most of the Ukrainians I know don't even like those guys. So what are we doing helping them out? That's kind of weird. So where have I seen this movie before? And when we beat down the Iraqis taking over that country, once we left, once the money ran out, the Iraqis took it all over. Same thing in Afghanistan. We beat down the Taliban for 20 years, and as soon as we left, they took it all over within a few days, few weeks. Right now we're pumping a stupid amount of money into Ukraine to beat down the Russians. And are the Russians just going to sweep through and take everything over the moment we stop the money flow? A lot of reports of some Western contractors hanging out in Ukraine. You listen to some of those interviews of Western volunteers on the internet, on the YouTubes, and they talk about a whole lot of not Ukrainian being spoken on the radio. So that's interesting. So who's actually winning? That's a really good question. So like I said, if we look at the battle map, here's Ukraine, here's Crimea down here, and you've got the Donbass region, and we can even zoom in. Here's the Kherson region. The Ukrainians have pushed back the Russians a little bit. The Russians used to have this Kherson city, over in these areas. You've got all these different, territorial forces and whatnot, artillery forces, and they're being opposed by, some Russian Marines and air assault regiment. So the Russians have been pushed back across the Dnieper River, and, recently this became a mess when somebody, I don't know who, blew up the dam. Ukrainians say the Russians did it, Russians say the Ukrainians did it. Well, both can't be true. So we've seen the Ukrainians make some gains here, just to the other side of the river, but largely the rest of this hasn't changed in like a year. You know, here's the area where the main Ukrainian offensive is taking place. They want to push down to cut off the land bridge between Russia and Crimea. You've got a lot of Ukrainian forces there. That's a lot of units. You know, we can click on these. You know, various mechanized brigades and reconnaissance battalions and whatnot. You've got some Russian motorized regiments and whatnot. So, you know, are they making some ground? Yeah, sure, they're making a little bit of ground. You know, I'll put a link to the military summary channel, and you know, they have a lot of videos going, kind of analyzing day by day the reports that both sides are making. But largely, this map hasn't really changed in a long time. You know, you've got, you know, up here in eastern Ukraine, you know, other than the Bakhmut area, you know, Ukraine's got pushed out of Bakhmut, but that took what, 6 months? You know, that was major fighting, and they're fighting around there. But the battle lines have largely been kind of static. You know, if we look up here to the north, you know, you just see an awful lot of blue Ukrainian icons. I love this website because you can see at least the publicly listed deployment. And then up here you have the Russian border, where, you know, in Belarus, where supposedly the Wagners are at. You know, are they going to go and sweep through? Are they going to sweep through the Kharkov area? Maybe. So, if you look at it big picture, though, not a whole lot has changed. So what's really going on? So how do we know who's actually winning? How can we tell? Because everything seems pretty static. Well, if I had to guess, this situation will remain constant until it can no longer, you know, remain. You know, things exist until they can't, and at some point, it's going to fall apart for one side or the other. You know, when I talk to my Ukrainian friends, you know, they tell me that Ukraine's having a really rough go of things. You know, one of my friend's little brothers was drafted and got sent off to Bakhmut. I haven't heard from him, you know, in 6 months. I have no idea if he's alive or not. But I'm told that it's pretty rough there. When I talk to my Russian friends, I mean, yeah, they're not too happy about there being a war, but they seem to be doing largely fine. You know, life in Russia seems to be pretty normal. When I was recently in St. Petersburg, you know, during the conflict, everything seemed fine. Seemed very similar to Russia before the conflict started. You know, whereas Ukraine right now, I don't think I'd want to go to Ukraine right now. You know, the city where a lot of my friends used to live, it's getting bombed. So, I mean, if nothing else, all the fighting seems to be taking place, or the majority of the fighting seems to be taking place on Ukrainian, you know, in Ukraine itself, in Ukrainian territory. You know, the Russians are not largely being affected. It's kind of like, you know, America in World War II. We weren't really that badly affected. Sure, we had Pearl Harbor, and we had a couple of minor problems, but the whole fighting took place in Europe. You know, Germany and France, Britain, they all got screwed. Russia got screwed. You know, that's where all the fighting was at. Right now, all the fighting's happening in Ukraine. So whenever something gets blown up, it's getting blown up in Ukraine. And Russia's largely not being touched. So just by that measure alone, it would seem that Ukraine's having a much harder time of things. Now, America's sending Ukraine a lot of stuff. And, you know, America's got a pretty big military industrial complex and big economy and all that. And we're told that, you know, Russia has a GDP smaller than California, which is probably true. But Russia produces about as much steel as we do. They produce about as much oil as we do. They produce about as much, you know, raw manufacturing stuff as America. Why is that? That's really weird. Well, because we outsourced all of our manufacturing to China and Mexico and various third world countries. So maybe this is a more fair fight than we would have thought. You know, Ukraine's got this big military. They say that Russia's nothing but mindless conscripts, but I don't know about that. You know, I don't really believe anybody. So what can we look for to see what happens? Well, in my opinion, I think that we should be very skeptical about things, and we should always be looking to find the truth. You know, and we can look through history to see similar situations. In World War I, the French and Germans had relatively static battle lines. You know, the British were there. They had a small army. The Americans came in late. But especially after the Russians got taken out because of their revolution and whatnot, it was just really between the, you know, on the Western Front, the Germans versus everybody else. The battle lines were really static. They didn't change that much for years. Then all of a sudden, Germans, they just started wearing out. You know, they couldn't replace their losses, and once things fell apart, the French and British and Americans swept through very quickly. So I have a feeling that Ukraine's going to be something like this. Now originally, and I'd made predictions in the past, originally I thought that the Russians were just going to sweep on through. I thought they were going to sweep on through, you know, through the Kharkov area, you know, in the north, and through the Kherson area towards Odessa in the south. That didn't happen, and I was very surprised. And is it because the Russians didn't have the means to? Well, if you ask the Western sources, they say, no, the Russian army sucks and they can't do it. Well, maybe. You know, if you ask the Russians about it, you know, they're talking about how they're trying to get into a war of attrition and grind down not just Ukraine, but grind down all the Western supplies. Because, you know, the Ukrainian army, if you listen to people like Douglas Macgregor, the Ukrainian army was defeated a long time ago, and the Americans largely, and the Europeans to some extent, the Polish especially, have been propping them up with people and supplies, weapons, money, etc. Well, which is it? Well, we sure are sending Ukraine a lot of money. What would happen if the money stopped? I have a feeling at some point the money's going to start scaling back. You know, at the NATO summit, Zelensky seemed to be a little bit out of place. I mean, I feel bad for the guy. You know, I'm sure he's doing the best he can. He's in a really crappy situation. You know, he's an actor who ran on a platform of peace. You know, he had an overwhelming majority of Ukrainians vote for him. And I was there in 2019 after he got elected. I was hanging out with my Ukrainian friends, celebrating Ukrainian Independence Day. And they were all thrilled. There's like, yeah, Zelensky got elected. We'll be the Switzerland of the East. We'll have a peaceful relationship with both Russia and Europe. And we'll make a lot of money and have a good life. Well, what happened? Well, I don't know. I mean, was it all a big lie, or did the oligarchs get to him? In Zelensky's TV show about what would happen if a normal guy became president of Ukraine, he talked about how the oligarchs would try to take over and corrupt and force the Ukrainian president to do their bidding. Is that what happened to Zelensky? Maybe. It's hard to say. I don't know. One thing's for certain, though. When he first got into office, he was talking about peace. And a couple of weeks before the Russians, you know, went in and started, you know, in force, he was talking about restarting Ukraine's nuclear weapons program. That seems a little out of character. And, you know, and now there's talk that maybe he's surrounded by a bunch of bad dudes, and maybe he doesn't have a choice, or maybe he's a bad person and he's in on it too. I don't think we're going to ever find that out. But here's something interesting. You can ask a lot of questions, and most of the time people don't care. You can ask, is the world flat? And nobody really cares. But if you ask, hey, where's all this money going? Then they start to get a little bit angry at you. Hey, you know, why was that FTX scandal using all that Ukrainian money and turning it into crypto and sending it back to various political parties like the Democrats? You know, why is Lindsey Graham so a Republican who's supposed to be the anti-war party? At least if you listen to, if you assume that Trump and DeSantis are the party leaders and they're wanting some sort of peaceful resolution. Why is Lindsey Graham such a warmonger in this? Well, if you look back to 2013, 2012, you know, he and John McCain and a bunch of others were kind of pushing for some stuff, and then back in 2014, 2015, once they overthrew the government, once the Yanukovych government was gone and Poroshenko was in, they were getting awards and, you know, maybe making some money. I don't know. That's why I say follow the money. And so whenever you ask a question and they get mad about it, then maybe you're onto something. It's like during COVID when people were asking, hey, is this death rate the real thing? Or are they fudging the numbers? Oh, you can't do that. Shut up, racist. Or hey, what are the studies about the vaccines? These seem a little bit. Why are we taking the big pharma companies who've lied to us in the past? Why are we taking them at face value? Oh, you can't do that. Shut up. You'll go to jail. You'll get deplatformed. I mean, so can we ask where all this money is going? I don't know. What I will say is this: the two narratives don't add up. You know, whether you believe Ukraine or believe Russia, they can't both be right. And personally, I'm disinclined to believe the Western narrative. You know, we've been lied to so many times about so many things that I'm kind of inclined to not believe them anymore. I mean, I never really did. But, you know, who am I? I've been to Ukraine. I've got Ukrainian friends, and they say that they're losing. In fact, some of my Ukrainian friends are on Russia's side. Oh, that's weird. I thought Ukraine was united against Russia. No, it's a civil war. There's a civil war going on. It's not all the Ukrainians fighting the Russians. It's some of them. A lot of the Russian casualties are really Ukrainians fighting against the Zelensky regime, fighting against the Poroshenko, in the past. They want their independence, and depending on what happens, they might get it. But a lot of the casualties have been Ukrainians fighting Ukrainians. They don't talk about that in the news. And, I know this because I've got Ukrainian friends on both sides of the conflict. Well, that's kind of weird. And like I said, the Russians don't seem to be having that hard of a time of things, everything seems to be normal, at least, when I was there a while back during the conflict, everything seemed to be normal. When I talk to my friends, they don't talk about the war anymore. They were really nervous about it in the early first couple of months. But now they're busy talking about, what movie they're going to see, or going to the bar, or watching a concert or whatnot. They're just living normal lives. And they're not worried about getting drafted so much. Some of them are. But I don't think Russia's fully mobilized. So I don't know. How are we going to tell? Well, at some point, and probably, with... I don't know how much longer America's going to keep on pumping money into this thing. America's got a lot of problems of its own. Our southern border's open. The economy's kind of sucky. And I don't think most Americans care that much. I was talking to a Russian guy once, and I've heard this from my Greek friends as well, and a lot of my European friends, and they say that Americans are great people who just want to be left alone, which is why their government gets away with doing so much overseas, because the American people don't pay attention. They're just rich and fat and kind of ignorant about world affairs. Americans don't pay a lot of attention to anything happening outside of America. Hell, we don't even pay attention to that much going on inside of America. We're too busy doing our thing. So that's kind of interesting. My gut feeling is, and it's always been, that Ukraine is a lot more important to Russia than it is to America. Just like Mexico would be a lot more important to America than it is to... Well, actually, Mexico's not that important to us, otherwise we'd secure the border. But maybe Canada's a lot more important to us than it is to, China. If China were to ever invade Canada, we'd probably go and fight off Canada. or fight China out of Canada. But Ukraine has historically been very closely connected with Russia. Ukraine and Russia have a long history. The Russian people basically originated, in Ukraine, is what I've heard. During the Russian Empire, they were all together. So, Ukraine's had a very complicated relationship with Russia for a long time. But look, ignoring any sort of morality, I'm not going to get into, this is right, this is wrong. War's bad. I don't like war. I don't like violence. Love and peace for everybody, okay? But the reality is that Russia cares an awful lot about what happens in Ukraine. I mean, obviously the Ukrainians care a lot about what happens in Ukraine too, but Russia's much bigger country. And Russia's got like 150 million people, and Ukraine has somewhere between 20 and 40, depending on what numbers you believe at this point, because a bunch of people have fled. But so it's basically America propping up Ukraine, and Ukraine's a lot more important to Russia than it is to us. Also, logistically, Russia just has to load stuff on a train and take it right over to Ukraine. It's right there. Whereas we've got to send stuff overseas to Poland and then ship it, and we've got a more complicated logistics. Now, America theoretically has a much larger economy, but most of our economy is in intellectual property and finance. Our manufacturing economy is not really that much bigger than Russia's. And, just recently Biden said we're running out of ammunition. Well, I thought Russia was the ones running out of ammunition. So, my advice is be skeptical about everything. Don't believe the West, don't believe Russia, don't believe Ukraine, don't believe Biden, don't believe any of these guys. And look and see with your own eyes what's actually going on. If you're lucky enough to know somebody in the region, ask them. They probably know more than you do because they live there. But the telltale signs are going to be, on the American side, why are we sending them these cluster munitions? They're not that good. They're good at killing infantry, but this is mostly an artillery and a tank battle. And if you listen to people like Douglas Macgregor, like Colonel Macgregor, he says that these cluster munitions have a high dud rate, and I remember that from the Iraq War. And they caused us a lot of problems. Our own munitions caused problems, so we don't like using them. Well, they're not that effective against the heavy Russian vehicles, and a lot of the Russian tank losses have been from Ukrainian artillery. But the cluster bombs aren't going to damage Russian tanks substantially. I don't think they'll damage anything more than like basic, unarmored vehicles. So why are we sending them cluster munitions if they're not good at blowing up tanks? That's kind of weird. On the other hand, we've been saying that Russia's been running out of ammunition since the very beginning, but they're firing about 10 times as many, artillery shells and missiles than the Ukrainians are. Well, that's kind of weird. How come they haven't run out yet? Oh, they've got these big Soviet stockpiles. Yeah, they probably do. They probably have a bunch of stuff. I can't imagine they throw anything out. Look at all these old tanks that they're retrofitting with, modern optics for indirect support roles and stuff like that. Oh yeah, I'm sure they've got warehouses full of stuff that they kept just in case something happened, and now something happened. Well, it doesn't look like they're running out. So ultimately, I think at some point the narrative's going to come crashing down, because either Russia's actually going to run out or Ukraine's going to actually run out, of weapons, manpower, money, whatever. And my guess is that it's going to be Ukraine. I think that we should have worked out some sort of peace from the very beginning, because I don't think this is going very well. I think this is going to be a tragedy for Ukraine, and that's really sad, because I love my Ukrainian friends. They're very good people. I've had a lot of fun hanging out in Ukraine in the past, and I don't want to see the places that I enjoy and the people I love being destroyed. But I don't think the Russians are going to stop, and I don't think we're going to let them stop either. We're not going to allow peace to happen. We're not going to negotiate peace with Putin unless he steps down. Well, he's not going to do that. Putin's basically the Tsar of Russia. And why would the Russians stop when they think they're winning? Whether or not Russia's winning or not is irrelevant. The Russian people think they're winning. They know they're winning. Just like, the American people know that we're winning. Or at least we think we're winning. Or maybe we're just watching too much CNN. Anyway, I hope you asked some good questions, because this whole thing smells kind of funny. And don't just take my word for it. I mean, largely I'm basing this off of what my friends have told me and from my personal experiences traveling to both countries. But I would be very skeptical of any mainstream information. And the important thing to remember is, if they've lied to you about one thing that you know about, they're probably lying to you about the stuff you don't know about too. Thank you very much, and have a good evening. Goodbye.